I'm pleased that you invited me here to share my work, and I'm happy to share it with all of you. So thank you so much for having me.
Good morning. I'm very happy to be here. I'm very honored that you invited me, and I'm very honored for the absolute
She's not on mic.
Thank you. Very good. There have been many revolutions in biology and in neurosciences. Many. The revolutions begin with new discoveries in science about the human brain and development, new advances in brain technology that allow us to look into living brains of people while they're alive and thinking and reasoning. There's even a new discipline that has emerged called educational neuroscience that bridges brain discoveries with child development in principled ways towards addressing looming problems in education. All of this has an impact on how children learn, it has an impact on educational policy, and it has an impact on education in the classroom. This is so contemporary, and the revolution is so strong that even last week, President Obama announced a $100 million initiative for the human brain. We are really standing in the moment of revolutionary change. Unfortunately, it takes time for that revolution to impact society. In fact, it takes time. And when I say revolution, I really mean revolution. This is a visual analogy. And for thousands of years, very intelligent humans believed the earth was flat. And so when I say that we're in a moment of revolution, I really mean that. And let's think about a moment. What is a revolution? Revolution is changing our minds. And I'd like today to discuss two discoveries that need to change our minds. The first discovery comes from biological work on the way sign language is acquired and represented in the human mind. The second set of discoveries involve the education and how it relates to sign language. And I'll go over each one. And with each one, I'll walk with you through the kinds of reasoning that we go through in science to make the decisions and discoveries that we make. So let's look at common beliefs about the biological status of sign languages. We know, for example, that if you stop someone on the street and you ask them, is sign language a real language? Most people will tell you yes, it's a real language. They have heard in the newspapers, they have heard that sign languages were real languages. And if you ask them, do deaf people have their own culture? Most people will tell you yes. But if you ask that same person, is sign language equal to spoken language? There's the question. That's where we get a problem. So, there is a general acceptance that sign languages are real languages. There is general acceptance that deaf people have a culture. But when we come to biology, it's been flatly rejected. I have gone to conferences and presented data to scientists who will sit there and look at me and say, yes, it's a real language, yes, it's a real culture, but it's different. It's different. And I say, well, how is it different? How? Explain to me. And here's what I get. I'm told speech is special, that speech is biologically superior, that speech and sign are not biologically equivalent, and that sign language is biologically inferior, and that exposure to sign language will actually hurt the development of speech. Now, these beliefs are fundamentally biological beliefs about the biological foundations of sign language. So I was puzzled by that, and I set out to test that hypothesis in science. So first, we have to look at that the situation with sign language is in a kind of double whammy type of situation. On the one hand, on your left is sign language and biology, common misbeliefs, common beliefs about the biological foundations of sign language. And on your right is misbeliefs and common views of bilingualism. And then when you add ASL and English, you have a kind of double whammy situation. With regard to bilingualism, you have often heard that early exposure to sign language hurts learning of English, and especially hurts children to read. You've also heard that early exposure to sign hurts auditory tissue development. Again, these are beliefs out in the air that have not been tested by many of those who are proposing them. So, in another corner of life, for the last 57 years, research has been going on to address these hypotheses. 40 of them I have been in the field. So here's the first hypothesis that we will test. So what we'll do is we'll take the view and we'll articulate it as a testable hypothesis. The view is that in human language, the child's development and maturation of their ability to speak and the maturation of their ability to hear guides human language acquisition, and that when we on the outside see a child hit every milestone, the reason we're seeing that in spoken language is because it reflects the development of their mouth articulatory muscles and the development of their ability to hear the phonetic and linguistic distinctions in their language. In this hypothesis, the presence of spoken language in the input is absolutely key, absolutely. So let's test this hypothesis. One of the things I did is I took children who were deaf children acquiring sign language from their deaf parents in Quebec, Langue Québécoise, LSQ, and I compared them to children acquiring spoken French from their hearing French parents. I also took children who were learning American Sign Language from their deaf parents and compared them to children who were learning English from their hearing parents. So what we have here are 4 languages, 2 modalities, and 2 countries. And the reason I stress this is because this is very important in scientific research, that your findings are generalizable. And what we found is that all of the children hit each and every milestone on the identical timetable. Well, this is extraordinary. Remember, the hypothesis is that speech is special. If the presence of sound is driving human language acquisition milestones, then children exposed to sign language should not hit every single milestone on the identical timetable. They just shouldn't do it, because our biology is developing over time, ostensibly, because of the development of speech. So if I take the child and I strip it of speech and give it sign language, the child's biological development should be deviant, and it's not. What we find is that every child hits the babbling milestone on time, the first vocabulary milestone by 12 months, the first 2 sign or 2-word milestone by 18 months, and so on and so forth. So that challenged the hypothesis right there. Let's go to another type of child. What about a hearing child in a signing-speaking family? These, we call them coders. Biologically, if speech is special, this child should turn away from sign input in the early moments of life. this child should favor any morsel of sound it can get from the environment. The prediction is that the child who's a coder should have an asynchronous acquisition of the milestones. The child should not show us the same milestones because they should be favoring speech, because speech ostensibly is biologically superior. And what we find is that these children hit every single milestone on the identical timetable. They hit their milestones in spoken language and their milestones in sign language on the same timetable. It's time-locked. I'll give you one example of a child. This is a 23-month-old child. The child's father is hard of hearing and speaks to the child. And the child's mother is profoundly deaf and signs to the child. This child hit every single milestone on the identical timetable, as did all the other children in the study. There's some audio with this.
Simone is almost 2 years old. He's signing. And he's speaking. His mother is profoundly deaf and signs to him. His father is partially deaf and speaks to him in French. Simone, who has normal hearing, seems perfectly comfortable with this arrangement.
So right there we have a challenge to the biological hypothesis. But now I'm going to show you an extraordinary population of children. These are hearing children who are in the homes of profoundly deaf parents. These children, by a variety of decisions, have not been exposed to spoken language at all. So let's go back to the hypothesis. If the presence of spoken language is absolutely critical for children to achieve normal milestones, what's the prediction about this child? A hearing child, normally hearing child who's getting no spoken language input. The child should be delayed. These children hit every single milestone on the identical universal milestone, universal timetable, as we see in all children all over the world. So these are hearing children with no spoken language input. Every milestone is hit on the same timetable. I'm going to show you a brief clip. This is an 18-month-old hearing child, has never been exposed to spoken language, only sign language, only sign language. This is a normal testing situation. The mom is going to be seated on the floor to your left. The baby sitting in the chair. This is a normal testing situation where we hold up objects and ask the child a name for things. You'll hear, those of you who hear, there'll be no vocalizations from the child whatsoever. The child only signs. And if you worked with 18-month-old children, this is entirely normal interaction. She looks to mom for confirmation, etc. So with the three types of populations, we immediately have a challenge to the biological assumptions that speech is special, and that the presence of speech is required in the input in order for a child to receive normal development. That was the overall timetable. But what about specific developmental structures? What about those structures that have universally been believed to be absolutely the core part of speech development, like the presence of babbling in children at around 10 months of age, 8 to 10 months of age. Hearing children who are exposed to speech around 8 months of age, begin babbling. Ba, 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 ba. Da, 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 da. The world said that was absolutely because of the development of the mouth muscles. So, we have a question. What would happen if you're exposed to sign language? Well, one of the things we found is that young deaf babies exposed to sign language will babble on their hands in the identical organizational unit. This is a very exciting finding. This finding shot around the world. Much to my shock, it appeared on the front page of the New York Times. This finding challenged the world's assumption that speech and language were one and the same thing. It broke it apart. Human language is in the brain. It outs itself on the hands or it outs itself on the tongue. It doesn't care what you give it. These children babbled in the phonetic units of hand primes and ASL. We've seen this internationally in other sign languages at the same developmental moment. It is not associated with the mouth movements. Instead, it's associated with the brain's sensitivity to highly specific rhythmic undulating patterns in the input. Patterns that are pressed onto the hand or patterns that are pressed onto the tongue. What we have in our brain is tissue that is sensitive to those patterns. It's a pattern-finding machine in the human brain. If you give it the patterns on the hands, it'll take the hands. If you give it the patterns on the tongue, it'll take the tongue. Let me show you an example of this. You're going to see a 9-month-old, profoundly deaf baby, 4th generation deaf, grandparents back 4 generations deaf. The sister's deaf, everyone in the family is deaf. You're going to see the child, I'll go back a moment. I'm off camera with the dad, signing about Mexican food. Watch the baby's eye gaze switching back and forth as he follows his daddy and me off camera. Then he's going to raise his arm into our sight line and begin babbling. These are phonetic units in ASL in a rhythmic undulating roll, open, close, open, close, open, close, just like the CV syllable structure of spoken babbling. The open, close, we used to think came from the constraints of the mouth. The child's going to open, close, open, close, open, close. It's not a constraint to the mouth. It's a rhythmic nucleus that the child has in their brain. That's what they're looking for. It's out onto the hands and out onto the tongue. It has nothing to do with the human mouth. At one point, you'll see that the sister is going to imitate him off to the dad. And mom says, oh, Nigga Maloney's learning language. Okay, let's take a look at that. Now, so what we have is a demonstration that the overall time course is the same when you're exposed to sign and speech. And we also have that very specific structures that get pushed out onto the tongue and pushed out onto the hands are identical across sign and speech. What that means is the brain has a common mechanism. It's so powerful, this mechanism. It wants so much a nucleus, a rhythmic nucleus, that it ignores radical modality differences called structural invariance across two radical different modalities. So the hypothesis that that generated was that it's, okay, I could step back. Psychologists, when they think something is the same, they use this heuristic, we say same mechanism. But these developmental findings had a radical implication for the human brain. Now the hypothesis is it's not the same mechanism, but maybe, just maybe, the identical brain tissue is governing speech and sign. This was a radical hypothesis. I spoke at conferences and had scientists stand up and scream at me, saying it's impossible. You will not find this. So let me just conclude on that the biology, the maturation of hearing and speaking does not determine the time course and structure of language acquisition. Speech is not critical for the achievement of normal language acquisition. So these are, now we'll turn to briefly to experiments where we looked at the neural tissue that was responsible for signed and spoken language. These were a long series of studies. The studies were over 18 years, many different varieties of studies, and I'll just briefly review the results. To appreciate the power of the result, I just have to tell you something about spoken language. The human mouth has the capacity to make hundreds of sounds. A fascinating thing about human language, spoken language, is that it only chooses from a highly restricted set of about 45 basic sounds. From that baby set of sounds, you make all the words and sentences in human language. It's really quite extraordinary that it's such a restricted set. We call those meaningless sounds phonetic units. And in spoken language, we absolutely know there's one swatch of brain tissue that does the job of segmenting them and responding to phonetic information. Now, sign languages presented the brain with a fascinating challenge. There are two articulators. They're external to the body. The mathematical combinatorial possibilities were infinite. One of the stunning linguistic universals that we have found is that old world sign languages, nonetheless, are formed from 40 to 45 basic hand primes, locations, movements, and orientations, but that is a stunning linguistic universal that exists flying in the face of the biological possibilities. All human language, be it sign language or spoken language, are formed from a highly restricted set of about 45 units from which you make all the signs and sentences in every sign language on the planet, from which you make all the words and sentences of every spoken language on the planet. That is a remarkable convergence of structure across two radical different modalities. This is a biological fact, and we've known it for 57 years, and it hasn't got out to the public yet. So let me show you what we did. So one other fact. The tissue in the human brain that controls the sound units in spoken language has been believed for 125 years to be unimodal sound processing tissue. So let me say this again, it's a very important fact. In the neuroanatomy, in the neuroanatomical studies of human speech, one particular swatch of tissue has been known to process phonetic units. And it has been believed for 125 years that the tissue is literally only processing sound and can process nothing else but sound. Okay, So now that you know that, here's what we gave deaf and hearing people in the scanner. There's going to be phonetic units in sign language. Okay, meaningless phonetic units in sign language. It's like I said, ba, da, pa, like strings of syllables. That's all it is. So, that's based on vision. It's based on hand movements. Does anyone see that have anything to do with sound? No, it has nothing to do with sound. What did we find? We found that visual phonology and sound phonology are in the identical brain tissue in the human brain. This is a very unusual finding because there is no, this tissue talks to the ear. This tissue is connected to the ear. The dogma was it must be sound-based, but what we found instead is not sound-based. The tissue can respond to sign language because sign languages are real languages. And the rhythmicity at the core of human sign languages is processed in the identical brain tissue. Now let me just tell you how identical this tissue is. We did a study of the deaf and hearing brains. And we did a volumetric study where we looked at the volume of gray and white matter in the human brain. The brains were scrambled, so we didn't know if we were looking at a hearing or a deaf brain. Then, to stack the deck against ourselves, we went right to auditory tissue. Primary auditory tissue, A1, and secondary auditory tissue, A2. We did a voxel by voxel study. This took 18 months of analysis, looking at the volume of gray matter and the volume of white matter. These are very important because it has to do with what kind of stimulation is getting into the tissue. If there's no stimulation, that tissue should shrivel up and die. What we found was identity between hearing and deaf brains, voxel for voxel, gray matter for white matter. Everything was identical. They were indistinguishable volumes. That means that there's activation in that tissue even in profoundly deaf brains because the tissue is not set for sound. It is set for patterns, highly specific patterns. We were wrong. Science was wrong for 125 years. We thought just because that tissue is sitting next to the ear, it must be processing sound. It is not processing sound. It is processing highly specific patterns that are in sound and in sign. Then we turn to say, well, what happens in a young deaf child? Is the tissue dead or alive? Young deaf babies. No one had ever looked at deaf babies. Well, we couldn't see that before because the big machines, the big functional magnetic resonance imaging machines, you can't put a baby in that. You can't even put a child under 5 in that. It's actually against the law unless the child's going to die. So we missed the first 5 years of brain development. We couldn't see it. Also, how many have been in one of these scanners? If you move, that's it. You've destroyed the scan. But babies move. Children move. What are you going to do? Well, there's been a revolution in technology. This is over here on your left. This is called a near-infrared spectroscopy system. I have this in my laboratory at Gallaudet University. This is more powerful than an fMRI. An fMRI, this machine, the fastest it takes the image from your brain is 1 picture every 2 seconds. This machine on your left takes a picture 10 times every second. This is a closer measure of neuronal activity than contemporary fMRI. Also, it tolerates movement. This is a child just sitting in a chair. It lets you sign. It lets you see sign input. It's quite extraordinary. So what we did is we gave phonetic units to young babies, and we asked ourselves, what brain tissue do they engage when they look at phonetic units in sign language? These are babies from 2 months old to 4 months old. And here's what we showed them. So these are just phonetic units in American Sign Language. And what we found is that all the babies were engaging the identical sound brain tissue that had been shown when hearing babies see syllable. Here's ba, ba, da, ba. Here, syllabic units in speech. It's the identical tissue we saw in the adults. It's called the STG. You saw it a few moments ago in the adult signing brains, and now it's seen again in the young babies. The only thing you really want to look at is the green hill. That is showing that the left hemisphere of these babies engaging the left hemisphere tissue that for 125 years was thought to be unimodal sound processing tissue, just like in the adults, is being engaged when they see phonetic units in sign language that have nothing to do with speech. So what do we know? We know now, and we do know this, in human language acquisition, we now know how children begin language. We know that the old view was that children had to hear sounds, then those sounds were shunted up to their motor cortex. The motor cortex then sent messages to the mouth, and then the baby began to mature over time in their ability to join speech with production of speech, hearing speech sounds and production of speech sounds. We now know that is no longer true. What we know is that the brain has a variety of what we call special processors. Another word we call it is a neural substrate. So what are these? Think of a car. Open your car. There are a variety of things under the hood. There's a carburetor, there's an engine, and each of those do their own job. And together the car moves forward. The brain has a variety of car parts, special processors. They're looking for highly specific types of patterns. If the input in the world around the child hits its senses and has the pattern, the brain will grab it and then send it to the motor strip and then partition the motor strip, and the child's brain will learn how to produce the form. So here's what we know. We know that rather than the child hearing, the child can hear, the child can see, that information floods over neural substrates, and if there's a lock and key with the environment, the child will be off on their way to learning the language, and I can explain more of that in the question period or later. We know that the brain has a variety of special processors. The first one we know is the STG, which pulls out phonological segments for the child. The second one we know to be, is called LIFC, which is going to pull out meanings for the child and morphological markings that have meanings. The third, called Broca's tissue, is going to pull out for the child the patterns of the input, the syntax. Each of these special processors, like car parts, together help the child learn language. Okay, so now what we know from biology, And I've just summarized, really, as I said, my own 40 years of work on my side and 57 years of work in the field, and biological evidence that the common belief that speech is special to the species, and driving human language acquisition is absolutely false. We absolutely know that the brain is not set for sound, it's set for patterns, and that speech and sign have equal biological status. So let's turn to the other set of data about education. There are common beliefs in education and sign. And now I'll summarize 3 types of findings, primarily from Visual Language and Visual Learning Center at Gallaudet University. Okay. The first one is that deaf children have attentional problems. You've heard this over and over again. The second one is that early bilingual exposure causes language delay and confusion. The third one is that early exposure to a sign language hurts the child's chances of learning to read English. We've heard this before. I'm going to talk to you about visual attention advantages that we're finding in young sign-exposed deaf children. I'm going to articulate bilingual advantages that we see in the human brain. And I'm going to articulate the discovery of visual phonology and its role in successful reading in young deaf children. These are very exciting findings. Each one in itself, I'm going to summarize very, very briefly, but they're absolutely essential for to address the common views that we hear and their impact on education. So, first one, visual attention. Groups of children were compared who were deaf and who were receiving sign language input, and who were deaf and who were not receiving sign input. Let's look a moment at the children who were profoundly deaf and not receiving sign input. If you studied their visual gaze and the rate at which they follow eye gaze, these children are slower at following eye gaze. Their rates of spontaneous looking is slower. What is the impact of that? These children had lower vocabulary levels, more difficulties reading, and overall literacy development, which was delayed relative to the children who were exposed to sign. Let's look at the children who were exposed to sign. Young deaf children who were exposed to sign in early life literally had changes to their visual systems that provided them with advantages. Let me just step back one moment. This is a very important finding. We used to think that the visual system in the human brain, we used to think it was unmalleable. We used to think it was set in stone, like our 10 fingers and our 10 toes. It was a stunning discovery to see that the visual system in the human being can be altered based on experience and input. So deaf children who got early exposure to sign language had changes in their visual system that provided them with advantages, really stunning advantages. Here they are. They more frequently shifted eye gaze to object and naming. Later, that had a remarkable advantage in book sharing and book reading and literacy. They had stronger vocabularies, stronger language skills, and stronger language skills in English and ASL. Not just stronger in ASL, stronger in English and ASL, and advantages to their literacy. Here's another advantage that the early visual input gave to these children. These children were more advanced in their self-regulatory attention and self-regulatory behavior. So it is not the case that deaf children are, by nature, lack attention. Deaf children who do not get early exposure to visual language can have attention issues, but it is not the nature of deafness that does it. These studies are pulling apart sensory loss from loss of language, Sensory loss from loss of language, think of that. It's not the condition of being deaf that makes these children have an attention issue. It's the condition of not having early exposure to a sign language that makes these children have attentional issues. Okay, let me just show you another way to say how this impacts. So, if you give a child an infant, early exposure to sign language, they have anticipatory looking, they have gaze alternation during the object naming, they have coordination of gaze among multiple tasks. That gives them spectacular higher cognitive advantages in addition to the language advantages. Let me show you the cognitive advantages these children get. So I'm differentiating language advantages from cognitive advantages. I've just told you language advantages. Now I'm going to tell you cognitive advantages. They have the attention gaze, they have self-regulatory inhibitory control there. They're better problem solvers. They score higher on classic cognitive scores than the children without early sign. They have stronger working memories, greater cognitive flexibility. So these are two sets of advantages from early visual exposure. Okay, and if we want to facilitate that the developing child, it certainly would look from the biological data that children should have early exposure to sign. Okay, so now let's turn just briefly to bilingual advantages. And this is very important because remember, with sign language, we have a kind of double whammy situation. There's biological prejudices against sign language, and there's misconceptions about bilingualism in general. And you put that together, and you have a double battle. So let's look at this a moment. The common beliefs are wrong. First, we hear bilingualism causes delay, and we hear that early sign language exposure hurts the child's spoken language development, their reading development, and their writing. No and no. What we found, and again, I'm sorry, I'm going to really go through this briefly, early exposure to two languages provides important benefits to the human brain. In particular, the tissue that's been given for language. It gets thicker, more volume. The greater computational demands on processing two languages plump it up like you would exercise in the gym. That has a spillover effect into the frontal lobe and affords anything that requires complex reasoning, switching between tasks, an advantage. It means our life. Our life is handling multiple cues and complex information. So it affords an advantage. It also affords reading advantages. We have found that monolingual children experience brain benefits from bilingual education. This is a stunning finding. It took years to do these analyses. We have found that bilingualism is such a powerful boost of the linguistic and cognitive abilities in the human being that children who are from monolingual homes, who are then put into bilingual schools, those children outperform monolingual children in monolingual tests of their abilities in English or French and every language we've tested in that kind of situation. Also, if you have children from a very low socioeconomic status, from this particular study, they were put into bilingual schools by virtue of where they lived in California. And we compared their performance on English tasks to children who were monolingual children in the highest SES schools in the entire United States. And those children from the low SES outperformed the children who were monolingual from the highest SES in the United States. And these are published studies, past peer review, and you can read them, and they're all available on my internet. We also did comparisons of children who were sequentially exposed to 2 languages, and then later first exposed to 1, and later exposed to the other majority language. And we compared them to schools where the children were receiving early simultaneous bilingual instruction. Simultaneous means within the same day, never ever at the same time. These children outperformed comparison groups in monolingual schools. Test for test, cognitive tests, nonverbal tests, visual spatial tests, linguistic tests, they outperformed the children who were monolinguals. We looked at the brains of bilinguals, and this is very exciting. Early exposure to 2 languages provides, we see, entirely normally developing use of the classic language brain tissue. And they get the bilingual advantage. They have enhanced higher cognitive and language advantages. Later exposed children had used different brain areas. They were able to process the language, but they were different brain areas. And that afforded a variety of linguistic and cognitive disadvantages. So they are recoverable, but if you see the brain is very sensitive to the age of first language exposure. And so the brain is unforgiving about age, but it's very forgiving about modality. It doesn't care about modality. It just wants the right pattern, and it wants it early. Okay, the final set of discoveries is very exciting, and I hope will have direct relevance in your own schools. This is, you saw before that the visual phonology is in the same parts of the human brain as speech. You also saw that the young deaf babies begin producing phonology in universal ways that are seen in all children, spoken or sign language. And now the question is, what is the relationship of the visual phonology when a child goes to learn to read? All right, and here's a situation. With the hearing child, the young emergent reader, the child who's 3 years old, 4 years old, just begin, 2 even, depending on the home, just beginning to make those pairings between letters and sounds and meaning, from ka'at, C-A-T, to the print on the page. We know that young hearing children use the phonological information as a bridge, as a gateway to meaning. And often for young deaf children, the question is, what do? They don't have access to sound. And so the lion's share of the focus has been on what the deaf child doesn't have. It's been deaf children don't have sound, poor deaf child doesn't have sound, they're not going to be able to read well. That's totally false. Deaf children have visual phonology. It makes sense. You just heard me show you the brain tissue. You just saw me show you in development. Deaf children who are exposed to sign language early in life have phonological information, fundamentally equivalent, homologous. This is not an analogy. I am not making an analogy. I am telling you this is a biological homologue. Visual sound-based phonology and visual phonology are equivalent in their formation, equivalent in their role. So the young deaf child in learning to read, who's had access to sign language, has in their phonological bin in their brain bits and pieces of the rhythmicity of signs and syllables, bits and pieces of the orthographic pattern on the page of the letters, bits and pieces of finger spelling, and that phonological information is used as their gateway, their bridge into meaning. So let me show you pictorially how this might look. What is visual phonology? for hearing children, it's still very controversial as to what is phonology. It can be phonemes. It can be phones. In the spoken literature, there's controversy as to whether it's orthography. Is a hearing child primarily using orthography as its bridge to meaning? It also could be the rhythmic and temporal patterning that's at the nucleus of human language, abiding by the bridge, the tissue in the brain. There's controversy as to whether or not phonology for the hearing child is syllabic. That it's at the syllabic level and not at the phonological level at all. There's controversy for the hearing child that in that box between the word on the page and their deriving meaning in their head, that in that box there's mouth articulatory gestures for the hearing child. And also there's controversy that for the hearing child, what's in that phonology box is actually pronunciation patterns. These are alive controversies in psycholinguistics today about what makes up phonological knowledge for the hearing child. And for the deaf child, the controversies are equivalent. We know that the child is using phonological information. We know it. What we're working out now is what are the core features of phonological knowledge and what is the weight of each one in that box. But we know the child has access to phonological information in vision, and we can use that to build their reading skills. We also know that it's the same neural systems and sites that are underlying sound phonology in spoken language and sound and sign phonology in deaf children. So what this implies is a revolutionary insight into human language. This is a very exciting and important finding. This shows us that the level of phonological information, be it phonology on the hands or phonology on the tongue, is universal to the species. And we can use that biological universal factor, we can use it in teaching young deaf children how to learn to read. We shouldn't turn away from their visual phonology. We can grab it and use it and expand it, and it can be used as a bridge. And children who have had this done are better readers. We can marry visual-based and sound-based phonological decoding. For example, in ASL rhyming, in ASL poetry, in ASL fingerspelling, and English letter and word pairing. It's what you might see your teachers do in chaining. They go cat and cat, elephant, elephant and elephant. That chaining is actually an advantage you're giving the child to chunk and segment the stream, for the child to be able to find word meanings in the first place. It's a segmentation machine. It's very exciting. I could talk to you about it later. So what I've shown you is that the common beliefs about the visual attention in young deaf children are actually false, that early exposure to visual sign language provides brain benefits. I've shown you that early bilingual exposure is optimal. It doesn't cause language delay or confusion. That if a child's exposed to signed and spoken language from early life, it provides the child with lifelong language, reading, and literacy benefits. I've also shown you that building visual sign phonological skills in deaf children is beneficial in early life, and that it actually enhances early literacy in English. And this is an exciting finding. that aspects of a visual phonology can enhance reading English in a completely different modality. So what are some of the policy implications? If we take together the common beliefs about biology and the common beliefs about education, and we consider the evidence do not support the common beliefs. And that would imply that we have to remove discriminatory practices and that we should not be withholding early sign language exposure to any deaf child, regardless of the circumstances. That early bilingual language exposure and bilingual reading is optimal. We also should require that the research findings are available to parents, fully to parents, and at the moment they find out their child is deaf. We also should require that the research findings are available to the medical industry, the teachers and policymakers. And I want to make a point that the fact that we have this spectacular ability to map human language out onto the hands and out onto the tongue is a species-specific biological adaptation that only we humans have. We have to celebrate it, see the whole picture. You can take a primate, a chimpanzee, a monkey. They are born whole. They challenge our notion of human development. They do not develop. Just think about that. We look at development as going from one state to maybe a more complex state. The most important thing we know about development is that it involves change over time. Imagine I held up a species to you that does not develop in the construct that we hold it. Chimpanzees are born whole. The cognitive capacities they have at age 3, let me go back. The cognitive capacity that a chimpanzee has at 3 days old is the cognitive capacity it will have at 60. It's like the Martians. It's like, I'm trying to shake us and get us out of our everyday view and not see that our neuroplasticity is part of our species-specific beauty. The reason we have neuroplasticity is because human thoughts are infinite. There is no bounds to your thoughts. You will never say the same sentence in sign language, and you will never say the same sentence in spoken language again for the rest of your life. Human language is by definition infinite. That infinity puts selection pressure on the human brain to make us have neuroplasticity. No other animal has it. We have it. So, it is unbelievable. The human biological system, all biological systems are fixed and flexible. We are fixed in terms of a rigid brain structure takes the processing, whether you give it the hands or the tongue. We are flexible in that the species can handle the expression of language to be either on the hands or the tongue. We are fixed and flexible, and that neuroplasticity is part of our species-specific trait. It is unique to humans, and we do not share that with other primates. So what I have covered, I've covered common biological beliefs. No, they're false. I've covered common educational beliefs about sign language. They're false. And so the question is, why have the myths persisted? Well, I alluded to them a moment ago, that more information is needed to doctors and clinicians. Also, more information is needed to educators and policymakers. Another problem is that research takes a very long time to reach the public. Do you know that what we find today, the average life it takes for a scientific finding to get out into the public is 50 years? We don't have that time. We do not have 50 years. If you have a son or daughter in this room, if you have a deaf child, you don't have 50 years. I just told you that early brain development is unforgiving. The child needs to have it now. Another reason that dissemination takes so long is that science has been wrong. I showed you one example, and I don't mean to be comical. For 2,000 years, our species thought the Earth was the center of the universe. But 2,000 years, that's a long time to have a wrong belief. Not only that, think of the parallels, and I'm trying to make a parallel here. That there was a double whammy here. It's not just intellectually you believe that. If you did not believe that, you did not believe in God. Galileo was thrown out of the church for proposing that the earth was not the center of the universe. That was only 500 years ago. That's all it was. That's all it was. So, the revolution in science is happening now. We're 57 years into the scientific knowledge. 57 years. That's enough. We know that biologically, speech is not special to the human brain. Instead, we know that the patterns in human language are what the brain has been genetically programmed to look for in the environment and to receive. We know that it's language that's special, not speech. And so, as I like to say, it's time to change our minds. The human brain does not discriminate. People do. Thank you.
That is powerful, extremely powerful. To be honest with you, I think for all of us, the schools for the deaf, we need to make a commitment to that bilingual approach. I feel like you've been validated. All of these schools, I mean, we don't have that validation in philosophy, and I think this is just a severe reason to reconsider some of your approaches. Bilingual, bimodal. So there we go. Good news for everyone here. Unexpected developments occurred this morning, and they're going to offer us, we're going to keep her a little bit more of her time. She was supposed to finish, have a break, and then we were going to a congressman, but he had to cancel, he couldn't come. And we're actually just a few minutes to answer some questions. Then we'll have a little break, and then we'll have Sean Burning, who's going to have the opportunity to talk about his dissertation. Let's take about 10 or 15 minutes for questions, if y'all wouldn't mind lining up, and we'll facilitate these questions. Trying to get on the stage, but quick second. Say who you are. I'm Mal Rosen, president of Riverside School for the Deaf. Hi. I've heard so much about you. I don't know if you mentioned it, but I've heard that when you're implants, you're taking in language through the cochlear implant, so it's going to the wrong part of the brain. Is that true? Or I just heard that. That was something that was on before.
The stimulation does go to some of the right parts of the brain because the probes are placed on highly specific tissue. But, is it very important but? Very, very important but. The question is it giving that tissue the right stimulation? Is it giving tissue, the patterns that the tissue is programmed to get, to need, to want for breakfast in the morning. And there's where we get into a problem. Let me explain what happened in science. I have to take you to another brain tissue to give you the answer. One of the parts of the brain we know the most about is the visual cortex. The visual tissue, if it doesn't have early stimulation, early input to the tissue, it will die. It's called atrophy. So in science, we often make analogies. So an analogy was made from the visual cortex to the auditory cortex. So the analogy is, if you don't get early stimulation, the tissue will die. That's the analogy. It turns out that it's wrong. It's a wrong induction, and we know inductions can be wrong. The cells in the visual cortex are fundamentally different from the cells in the auditory cortex. It's called cytoarchitectonics. Okay, the point is, that the cells in the auditory tissue die if you give it the wrong pattern. So getting in early is not what's crucial for the tissue. If you come in early and you give the wrong pattern, then you kill the tissue. So the problem is that the challenge for the cochlear implant is that it has to give the right pattern to the child or it will kill the tissue. So the analogy from visual cortex is wrong. If you don't get into the visual tissue, you will kill it. If you don't get into the early auditory tissue, it won't die. Because remember, the tissue is not looking for sound. It's looking for patterns. That's the problem with the cochlear implant. That's the problem. Because it does not have the capacity to, with 100% fidelity, give that tissue the right patterns. It does not. Not at this time. And so that's the problem. The early implantation has the possibility of destroying the tissue. Now, remember, all deafness is not one and the same. Maybe there'll be one child who has a certain range of deafness that it won't be touched by the damage that the cochlear implant's going to do, and the child will survive anyway. But that's the challenge for cochlear implants. It has to get the right pattern. I've just showed you a series of data that the cochlear implant has to give the child the right pattern to keep the tissue alive. It's not a matter of early stimulation, well, that's it. No. Early stimulation of the wrong pattern killed the tissue. So that's the real answer.
Hi, I'm Arlene Lucien, and I'm the director of Gallaudet, University Regional Center Southwest. Hello. I think she's just done an amazing job. You gave me goosebumps 10 times last week when you speak, and I'm just amazed each time. One of the questions I wanted to ask there is asking you your strategies or thoughts. If 80% understanding that the kids don't have language access at home, so they're learning sign language. But if they're going to a mainstream program, it's almost like a double barrier, so it's a big problem for us that we see working in the outreach field. I'm trying to think, how can we, as deaf people, advocate for parents and support them? What are some strategies or suggestions or ideas? I'm just curious.
Thank you for your question. That is an enormous question. I can't answer all parts of that question. The problem is, from my biological perspective, it's very serious. It's a serious delay of the right systematic language for a young child. And you're right, it's a double block. If they don't have early sign language exposure, and then they get to a mainstream school, it's really like a sentence for the child of having learning challenges their whole life. Okay. But on the good side, and I'm very excited about this, a young human child, their brain is not on it's not looking for quantity. The human brain doesn't measure how many hours it gets of ASL and how many hours it gets of English. The brain doesn't look for amount, it looks for quality. And when I mean quality, that tissue is really biologically given. It just wants to see the pattern. If it encounters the pattern, it will grab it and use it. So, even getting into those hearing families and educating them about the value of exposing your child to sign language will provide amazing benefits to that child, even if they're not fluent signers, because the brain doesn't need to see perfect signing. It needs to see the patterns of sign language to turn on the motor to begin to analyze it. And then the children, as species, will go beyond the input. We have a lot of evolutionary junk in us. Things that we needed 300,000 years ago that we don't need today. Hundreds of thousands of years ago, we did not have the beautiful middle-class families that we have today, with moms and dads who read books to our children. The children were left in packs, and the adults went off to hunt and gather. Children learn from fragmentary input, the language that they were going to speak, and from other children. They didn't have to have Shakespeare read to them. The species learned language. So a hearing parent who is not a perfect signer can still provide that child with fantastic linguistic and cognitive benefits. And putting that child with other deaf children who sign would give that child spectacular benefits. And those are mechanisms that are within our grasp. We can do that.
Still more time, but to respond to the question that you did ask, I'm sure that all of you know about our Teresa Parker, the oral movement, oral only movement. Very powerful script. A very powerful script they're using in Florida, they're using in Pennsylvania. I saw this happen in New Mexico. That is script. It's the wrong fact, it's misguided, it's misleading. But if you get in a position of hers where you're finding this, it might work with this. If we can come up with a counter script that actually corrects those miscues. And with your help, I think she's very skilled wordsmith as well. She's an amazing researcher, and I've worked with her. Maybe we can disseminate that script that you can use with parents, with legislators, etc. So I'm going to go ahead and answer your question.
I'm going to use my voice because I'm trying to articulate kind of what Ron was talking about, one of the scripts that I'm hearing lately in early intervention, and that's in the area of brain research. The latest, most exciting brain research is being reported that they're finding that through exposure to sound, the auditory pathways of the brain develop, and without 4 after, and they had a specific age in the research that they were reporting. After the age of 2, then that child will lose the ability to process auditory information.
I have read these studies. I know, I referred to it in the beginning of my talk because now the arguments are getting more interesting because they're pulling in the pocket of brain scientists who will say anything you want, but who will say, report this. If I gave you, this one thing I have to respond to. There is no rerouting to vision, and this is, it is absolutely false. This is again utilizing an expectation and taking it to an extent that is not true of the brain. Let me just step back and give you why. I showed you brain tissue that is brutally, rigidly taking on a function, a language function, in a dramatic way, irrespective of whether the information is on the hands or the tongue. That means that this tissue has had no reorganization. This is very important. There is no neuroplasticity here. That tissue has a function, and it will not do anything but that function, and it so doggedly wants that function that it will do it if you give it the hands, and it will do it if you give it the tongue. That's a dramatic defiance of neuroplasticity. But they're using your fear of neuroplasticity, which we all know. We've heard about it for 10 years. The 90s was the decade of the brain that began this. We all think, oh my God, neuroplasticity. It turns out that that tissue is not neurally plastic. That's what I was talking to you about before, that incredible dance between being biologically fixed and biologically flexible. The tissue does not reorganize, it doesn't reroute, it doesn't pull in the auditory. There are no tracks into that tissue from the auditory path. There's no tracks into that. The tissue is not reorganizing, and it's not vulnerable to neuroplasticity. So it's taking a grain of truth, something we know about neuroplasticity, and instilling a fear in us. Get in early. Neuroplasticity. Now's the time. What we now know, without having to wait 50 years, I'll tell you, do you know the hottest thing right now in neuroscience is to look at the limits of neuroplasticity, to look at its boundaries. We're not excited anymore about neuroplasticity because we were wrong. We gave it too much power. The human child has limits. The time frame within which things happen is not forever. Also, just think of it, it's because we're still evolving in our knowledge. From the neck down, there are organs. There's a heart, a liver, a kidney. Well, there's some systemic flexibility. My heart's not going to function like my pancreas. My liver's not going to function like my kidney. The neural tissue that's allowing the child to segment the stream is not going to suddenly function like something in the visual cortex. The cell structure is completely different. The genetic information to the tissue is completely different. So it's taking a tidbit of what's true and distorting it. If you give early exposure to a child to French and English, you will excite dual pathways that are in the same classic language areas, strengthening it and making it bigger and more robust and take up more real estate in a way that gives you cognitive and linguistic advantages. If I only give a child exposure to English, I will absolutely encourage encourage the English pathways to mature. But they're giving you half the equation. If you gave the child the sign language, the child will have the dual stimulation and the dual pathways, and the child would get for free the bilingual advantage. I have parents who come to me who want to give their babies, it's called baby Einstein toys. I tell them, don't spend the money. Get a babysitter who speaks another language. Get someone who signs to the baby. You give all the cognitive advantages that you have to that baby without spending all that money on the toys. So it's like taking bits and pieces and fragmentary information and only giving you a part of the story. I'm going to end with one other comment. Our species, just think of how absurd this is, our species was not neurologically and biologically programmed to be monolingual. That's a kind of American view. I have to tell you, biology we were nomadic. We were nomadic. We had to be able to communicate with multiple encounters, multiple groups. Do you know that next week at the Society for Research in Child Development we'll be announcing a freebie? And the finding is that the everyday monolingual child is born with two hemispheres of its brain having the capacity to receive and process human language because they are not exposed to two languages. The monolingual child's brain essentially retreats into the left hemisphere. The hearing monolingual child, the hearing child, is born with a capacity that they lose in the first few months of life if they're not exposed to two languages. And the human brain attenuates down to one hemisphere only because it wasn't exposed to two languages. So the monolingual child has lost something that the bilingual child has. And so if you take a young deaf child and you only stimulate it by giving it a cochlear implant, you will get stimulation to the auditory cortex. Of course you will. You'll get a monolingual child. But you lost the bilingual benefits that that brain could have had. And everything else. The language benefits, the cognitive benefits, the cultural benefits. I could go on and on.
Hi, I'm Phil Brady, President of the Board of Gallaudet. I got up here because I have a big deaf family, over 200 deaf relatives and grandchildren, fifth generation deaf grandchildren. Something I was thinking about, and I might have missed, or might be out of your scope of work, is you focus in on bringing language in the receiving part of language. And I applaud you for all the work you've done, close to a Nobel effort, I'm sure. One day we'll be seeing that. My specific question is deaf children who are receiving language. I understand that part of it. But how do they get the transition to the written language? Because that doesn't seem to be in accordance with how they're receiving language. So why are those two things different?
Actually, the processes can be very similar if the child had early exposure to sign language, and if, as parents and teachers, we use sign language as a bridge to letter recognition, word recognition, and ultimately writing. That in principle, there need not be any differences at all in how a young child learns writing in a hearing child in English and how a young deaf child learns writing in English. There need not be a difference. Part of the difference we are seeing is an artifact of the histories of the children. If they show up at school at age 5 and never saw sign language, if they show up at age 10 to your school and never saw sign language, oh, they will have a problem reading. But so will a Chinese child who shows up at school and tries to learn to write in Chinese at age 10. It's not an endemic problem of deafness. It's a problem of how the child, the experiences the child was given, the richness of experiences the child was given. If the child was given a normal language context, the child's learning to read and write would be typical.
One last question.
I can only imagine, I can only speculate that advocates of total communication, the philosophy of total communication, where they utilize both a visual and an auditory, can interpret this research and suggest and advocate their philosophy as okay.
Thank you for asking that question. I am so sad that I have lived long enough to have written have conducted the first study in the history of science in 1976 that evaluated from a brain perspective, from a psycholinguistic perspective, what is total communication. And we did this in 1976, and Bill Stokoe published it in Sign Language Studies, the first paper ever that showed that the brain cannot handle sign language and speech at the same time. So nothing that I'm saying supports total communication at all whatsoever. You absolutely must give a child a full language ASL, period. And then you give a child a full spoken language, period. And you cannot give them at the same time. You just absolutely, I have done systematic, in-depth analyses. I actually thought it was dead. I went to a conference for the first time a month ago and I was shocked that there are schools in the United States who are now turning to it as if it's a brand new toy. And for the first time, throwing in everything and committing to C and TC, total communication, and other forms. And we have shown you cannot do that. We cannot process it. We make even the best teachers, the teachers who know they're being filmed, so they're going to do their best job. We cannot process two linguistic systems at the same time. We can't do it. Who would expect that in a German classroom, in Germany, for a child to have headphones on and to hear German and French at the same time? Who would expect that? That is what it's like. What do you think the human brain